want to get into disinfection in a fairly big way, because certainly that's a strong suit of peroxide. But I do want to touch on one thing, and that is peroxide has a very strong reputation for cleaning. Aside from the additives, which have helped that, the surfactants, does the panel see peroxide as a very, very effective cleaning solution? Mila, you're sort of nodding.
Absolutely, Art. It's actually one of the reasons and the logic behind me using it for those patients who may have seasonal sensitivities like seasonal allergies, those patients who have GPC and don't maybe have a daily disposable option to transition into. This solution is a phenomenal choice for these patients, and it is so because, again, we know the disinfection efficacy is high with hydrogen peroxide systems. It sets the standard or the bar that everything else is kind of compared to clinically. But in addition to that, we see it clinically. These lenses just come back and they're cleaner. So, Art, from a practical, clinical perspective, I just see what the data actually represents and shows us with patients.
That's a great point. You mentioned GPC, and it's not something we talk all that much about anymore. But I remember when GPC was rampant, peroxide was our go-to solution, and peroxide was very effective. Bill, I know you're the king of creating GPC, and it's really GPC because it's Texas, so it's giant papillary conjunctivitis. What are your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are that the lenses look good, but I've always wondered why. I mean, there's not really a surfactant in hydrogen peroxide. So my question is, does the hydrogen peroxide lyse the cells or the debris that are actually on the surface? Because these patients are restricted.
Peroxide penetrates lipids.
Yes.
It also breaks down the organic substrates and protein bonds. So it definitely removes, and I learned that in optometry school, that I still remember that today, that it breaks down, that's why it's good for GPC. Breaks down the protein bonds, denatures them, and removes them off the surface.
Exactly. And I think clinically, my experience is probably similar to everyone's. I mean, I've had really good results with that. And in the old days, Miraflow. Miraflow and peroxide was really the way to go.
And that's where we started from. We used a separate surfactant cleaner along with the peroxide. And so there was this habit that developed with peroxides of this rub and then, putting it through the system. And I think many doctors out there still use a rub, rinse, and soak system with peroxide, whereas patients may see one bottle solutions as pop a drop, take the lens out and just throw it in without doing that separate rubbing step. And so I think that, again, we very frequently will include a rub step in with the peroxide system.
Well, that goes back to the comments I think that Neil made, that I think that we tend to help patients comply because we tend to be more verbose in our directions with peroxide. So we actually do help with compliance. By the way, for those of you who are on the phone, we've just entered a romantic period. One of the lights went out, and it's gotten very moody and romantic here. So I just wanted to know we're having a slightly different experience than you guys are. But I think that cleaning, compliance, patient issues all go hand in hand. One of the things that Loretta mentioned, which I think is critically important, is that microorganisms want to survive at all costs. So they very rapidly develop strategies for survival, and there are some organisms that produce enough antioxidants, catalase, peroxidase, to survive the initial burst of peroxide in a catalytic disc system, and then they survive. And some of them produce biofilms, and you're one of the world's experts on those issues. So what are your thoughts on peroxide relative to biofilms? I know you've done research on it.
Right, well, as Mila said, really peroxide seems to be the gold standard, and the MPSs, MPDSs seem to, some function just as well, but that is gold bar that we're trying to achieve. So we've done work both in fungal and bacterial biofilms using clinical isolates. So, came from contact lens inflammatory conditions or contact lens ulcers, microbial keratitis. And we found that all of those strains that are clinical isolates form biofilm. By the way, that's not true for some of the FDA strains. The fungal isolate that's required in the FDA for Fusarium solani doesn't even form biofilm. It's a very old isolate, so it's kind of an irrelevant organism anyway. So all of the clinical isolates form biofilms on contact lenses. That was our first step to show that indeed they form on contact lenses. We haven't done work to show that they form inside cases, but every study you can read back to the 70s talks about biofilm in contact lens cases. So we developed a model to look at disinfection efficacy on biofilms formed on contact lenses, and different contact lenses, not just the leading silicone hydrogels, but some low decay lenses as well. And for bacteria, peroxide, and the one we tested was ClearCare, was the only one that was able to eradicate biofilms formed by Pseudomonas, Serratia, and Staph aureus. That would be Serratia marcescens, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, for the record. Most of the PHMB preserved systems, actually all of the PHMB preserved systems, could not even touch the biofilm. And some of the OptiFree products that we tested were efficacious against 2 out of those 3 organisms. But peroxide was the only one effective against all 3. And that is different than the planktonic experiments where you're doing it on free-floating organisms, which is what the FDA requires. So what we know about disinfection when it comes to planktonics is that they all do a great job. But you start to see differentiation when you look at the resistant biofilms that definitely form in cases, and these organisms encapsulate themselves and protect themselves from the environment, make it much harder to disinfect with both the host immune responses as well as from disinfection products that are on the market. For fungal biofilms, we also found that only peroxide, and we looked at Fusarium oxysporum and Fusarium solani, and only peroxide was effective against both of those isolates on all contact lenses tested.
That's the work was phenomenal, by the way. It was really groundbreaking work, and you drew attention to something that is I think a very, very serious issue, and that is our disinfection standards are based on planktonic bacteria, and the reality is that we deal with biofilm forming organisms more often than not, and you're exactly right. There are studies that go back to the 70s that show massive concentrations after time, even in peroxide, of biofilms. So I think one of the things that that I just want to discuss very, very briefly is the need for a gold standard, from a clinical point of view, because we can't rely on FDA standards at this point, and we have to take control of that from a risk management point of view in our own offices. And we need to be looking for gold standards, whether we're looking at peroxide when it's appropriate for a patient or we're looking at an MPDS. We need to ensure that those products function adequately and optimally. So any thoughts on how you approach that? And I'll open this up to to the phone group as well. Do you take that seriously? I certainly do. I don't see FDA standards as having as much relevance as I once did, and so I'm looking for products that I consider to be gold standards, and certainly ClearCare is among them.
Well, I guess I'm just.
Okay, Bill.
Go ahead, Bill.
Go ahead, Bill, and then Neil.
Okay, so when we actually sit down and there's been numerous studies that show that when we compare the FDA testing to real life, it's almost like a fairy tale because you're dealing with there's no lens in the testing, like in the vial or the test tube. We know that glands itself can make a tremendous difference, maybe by absorbing bacteria or whatever. So I mean, there's that. In fact, we also these are basically organisms that have been used over and over. Whereas, I mean, I had looked at an article earlier where they actually took this strain of acanthamoeba that was taken out of the tap water of Chicago, and it was apparently a terrible, very, very difficult to kill organism. So I think that we can, I won't say that it's irrelevant, that the FDA testing is irrelevant, but I think that it should probably be reevaluated for something that's more purposeful and more impactful on the day-to-day practitioner and our patients.
Well, I think that that's underway, but it's taking a long time. Eventually, we will have better standards that are more reflective of what we're seeing in the environment. But I think it's important for our colleagues to recognize that as a potentially big issue.